Imagine the year is 1940. You are a soldier in a muddy trench, and suddenly, the sky begins to scream. It's a high-pitched, terrifying wail that vibrates in your very bones, growing louder and more frantic every second. You look up, but you see no bird, only a crooked-winged predator diving vertically from the clouds, straight at you. This was the Jericho Trumpet, the psychological weapon of the Ju-87 Stuka. It didn't just carry bombs, it carried pure, unadulterated fear. Today, we're diving into the history of the most terrifying aircraft of World War II, the dive bomber that broke the spirit of Europe before the tanks even arrived. The Junkers Ju-87, universally known as the Stuka, was a machine born from a radical and brutal obsession with precision. In the early 1930s, while other nations were focused on massive, horizontal bombers that dropped carpets of bombs with questionable accuracy, the German Luftwaffe looked for a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. They wanted an aircraft that could fly directly over a target, tip over its wing, and dive at an 80-degree angle, dropping a single bomb with surgical precision. The result was the Ju-87, an ugly, fixed-gear monoplane with inverted gull wings that made it look like a vulture frozen in mid-air, ready to strike its prey. The design of the Stuka was a triumph of function over form. It wasn't built to be beautiful or fast, it was built to be indestructible during the immense physical stress of a vertical dive. Its most iconic feature, the gull-shaped wings, allowed for a shorter and stronger landing gear while keeping the massive propeller clear of the ground. Everything about the Stuka was reinforced, the heavy engine mounts, the thick tail, and the specialized dive brakes. It was a rugged, mechanical beast that could operate from primitive, muddy airfields near the front lines, ensuring that the flying artillery was always right where the infantry needed it most. The true secret of the Stuka's accuracy lay in its revolutionary automatic pull-out system. Diving at 80 degrees meant the pilot experienced massive G-forces that could cause him to black out the moment he released the bomb. To prevent the aircraft from simply flying into the ground, Junkers engineers developed a system that would automatically pull the plane out of its dive the moment the bomb was gone. This allowed the pilot to concentrate entirely on his aim, knowing that the machine would save his life when the world went black. It was a terrifyingly advanced piece of technology for the 1930s, making the Stuka the first smart weapon in history. But the most legendary and controversial part of the Stuka was the Jericho Trumpet. Attached to the fixed landing gear were small, wind-driven sirens that produced a haunting, soul-piercing scream as the aircraft accelerated in its dive. This was a deliberate act of psychological warfare orchestrated by Ernst Udet and the Luftwaffe High Command. The sound served no tactical purpose other than to paralyze the enemy on the ground. It told every soldier in the target area that death was coming from above, and there was absolutely nowhere to hide. Even decades after the war, veterans still recall that scream as the most traumatizing sound they ever heard. In its early debut during the Spanish Civil War, the Stuka proved to be a terrifying success. The Condor Legion used the Ju-87 to obliterate bridges, supply depots, and command centers with a level of accuracy that seemed impossible at the time. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a psychological hammer that shattered the morale of the Republican forces. The lessons learned in Spain were integrated into the Blitzkrieg doctrine, cementing the Stuka's role as the primary tool for breaking the enemy's will before the ground forces even made contact. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where the sky itself became a weapon of terror. By the time Poland was invaded in September 1939, the Stuka was ready to show the world the true meaning of Blitzkrieg. It functioned as mobile, high-precision artillery that could be called in by radio within minutes. If a Polish bunker held up the panzer advance, the Stukas would appear, scream down from the clouds, and delete the obstacle with a 500-kilogram bomb. The world watched in horror as the Polish army, one of the most courageous in Europe, was systematically dismantled by an enemy that owned the sky. The Stuka had become the symbol of Nazi power, an ugly, screaming vulture that signaled the end of the old world. The campaign in France and the Low Countries in 1940 was the Stuka's absolute peak of glory. Here, the aircraft operated in perfect harmony with the panzer divisions, creating a rolling wave of destruction that the French and British armies were completely unprepared for. As the German tanks raced toward the English Channel, the Stukas were their guardians, clearing the roads and striking fear into the hearts of retreating columns. The psychological effect of the sirens, combined with the devastating accuracy of the bombs, created a sense of Stuka phobia among the Allied troops. Soldiers would abandon their vehicles and dive into ditches at the mere sound of a screaming dive, even if no bombs were actually dropped. Nowhere was the Stuka's impact more decisive than at the crossing of the Meuse River at Sedan. The French defenders were dug into heavily fortified bunkers, expecting a traditional artillery duel that could last days. Instead, the Luftwaffe unleashed hundreds of Ju-87s in a constant, rotating cycle of attacks. For 5 hours, the French soldiers were subjected to a non-stop storm of screaming dives and heavy explosions. Even though the actual casualties were relatively low, the psychological strain was unbearable. Entire French regiments simply broke and fled, their nerves shattered by the relentless aerial terror. The Stuka had opened the door to the heart of France, proving that a screaming plane could do what 1,000 cannons could not. The Stuka was also a lethal predator at sea. During the Norwegian campaign and the evacuation of Dunkirk, the Ju-87 proved to be the most dangerous enemy of the Royal Navy. Because it could dive vertically, it was incredibly difficult for anti-aircraft gunners to track and hit. A single Stuka could dive on a moving destroyer and drop a bomb directly onto its deck, often sinking ships with a single strike. The British sailors, used to the relative safety of the sea, found themselves hunted from above by a machine that seemed to ignore their defenses. It was a brutal lesson in the changing nature of naval warfare, where the dive bomber had replaced the battleship as the ultimate threat. However, the Battle of Britain provided the first brutal reality check for the Stuka. Over the skies of England, the Ju-87 finally met its match, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The very features that made the Stuka a great dive bomber, its fixed gear, heavy armor, and slow speed, made it a sitting duck for fast, modern fighters. Once the Stuka began its slow climb out of a dive, it was practically defenseless. The screaming vulture was being torn out of the sky in such numbers that the Luftwaffe was forced to withdraw the Ju-87 from the battle entirely. It was a clear signal that the Stuka could only rule the sky if the German fighters had already cleared the way. Despite its failures over Britain, the Stuka found a new lease on life in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Against the British forces in the desert and the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, the Stuka remained a terrifying force. It was instrumental in the fall of Crete, where it functioned as a precision strike force against Allied ships and mountain positions. In the clear, open skies of the desert, the Stuka could spot moving convoys from miles away and strike with devastating effect. It was here that pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel began to build their legendary reputations, proving that in the right hands, the old Ju-87 was still a lethal tool of war. Life for a Stuka pilot was a relentless cycle of extreme physical and mental stress. Each mission required the pilot to push his body to the limit, enduring massive G-forces that would make his vision go black and his heart race. They flew low-level missions through intense anti-aircraft fire, often returning with their planes riddled with bullet holes. The bond between the pilot and his rear gunner was a matter of life and death. The gunner was the only one who could warn of an approaching fighter or defend the aircraft's vulnerable tail. It was a specialized, dangerous brotherhood, and by the middle of the war, the veteran Stuka crews were some of the most skilled and battle-hardened airmen in the world. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Stuka returned to its role as the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg. But as the war in the East evolved into a brutal struggle of attrition against thousands of Soviet tanks, the Ju-87 underwent a radical transformation. The Stuka was no longer just a dive bomber, it was becoming a dedicated tank hunter. This led to the development of the Ju-87G Kanonenvogel, or cannon bird. This version removed the dive brakes and sirens, replacing them with two massive 37mm anti-tank cannons mounted under the wings. It was a slow, clumsy, but incredibly lethal machine designed to hunt the T-34 from the sky. The 37mm cannons were so powerful that they could punch through the thin roof armor of any Soviet tank. However, firing them was an exercise in extreme skill. The recoil was so violent that it would nearly stall the aircraft in mid-air. The pilot had to fly incredibly low, often just feet above the ground, and fire at the precise moment to hit the engine deck or the turret rear. It was a suicidal form of combat that required nerves of steel. The Kanonenvogel didn't dive anymore, it stalked the battlefield like a low-flying predator, picking off Soviet tanks one by one with a level of accuracy that even modern attack helicopters would admire. No discussion of the Stuka is complete without the name Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Rudel was the most decorated German soldier of the war, and he flew the Ju-87 for nearly the entire conflict. He survived over 2,500 combat missions, a staggering number that seems impossible. Rudel was credited with destroying over 500 tanks, a battleship, a cruiser, and hundreds of other vehicles. Even after losing a leg in combat, he returned to the cockpit to continue hunting Soviet armor. Rudel became the personification of the Stuka's lethal potential, a pilot who used a supposedly obsolete aircraft to inflict more damage than an entire armored division. The Eastern Front was a landscape of endless targets for the Stuka crews. They flew from dawn until dusk, striking at Soviet supply lines, rail hubs, and massed armored formations. But the environment was increasingly hostile. The Soviet Air Force was growing in strength and quality, and the skies were no longer safe for the slow-moving junkers. Stuka pilots had to develop circle tactics, where several Ju-87s would fly in a defensive ring, their rear gunners providing a wall of fire to protect each other from Soviet fighters. It was a desperate, bloody game of survival where every mission felt like it could be the last. In the winter months, the Stuka crews faced the same frozen hell that defeated the German army. Engines wouldn't start, oil turned to jelly, and mechanics had to work in sub-zero temperatures to keep the aircraft flight-ready. The Stuka's fixed landing gear, once a design strength, now became a liability as it acted like a plow in the deep snow. Yet, despite these hardships, the Ju-87 remained the most requested support aircraft for the German infantry. Whenever the T-34s broke through the lines, the soldiers on the ground looked to the sky, hoping for the distinctive silhouette of the screaming vulture to save them from the Soviet onslaught. By 1944, the Stuka was officially a relic. It was too slow to survive without massive fighter protection, which Germany could no longer provide. Most Ju-87 units were converted to the Focke-Wulf 190 in the ground attack role, but a few dedicated Stuka wings fought on until the very end. The Kanonenvogels continued their hunt, striking at Soviet bridgeheads and tank columns during the final retreats through Poland and into Germany. The Stuka had been there at the first hour of the war, and it would be there at the last, a defiant, battered machine that refused to quit even as the Reich crumbled into dust. The final days of the Stuka were spent in the desperate defense of Berlin. In the chaos of the final retreat, Stuka pilots flew mission after mission into a sky filled with thousands of Soviet and Allied fighters. It was a massacre. The slow-moving junkers were hunted down like prey, falling in flames over the ruins of the country they once dominated. When the surrender finally came in May 1945, very few Ju-87s were left in flyable condition. Most were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, or captured and scrapped by the Allies who saw no value in an aircraft that was so specialized and vulnerable. The legacy of the Stuka is one of dark brilliance and mechanical terror. It was the first aircraft to truly integrate psychological warfare into its design, proving that fear is a weapon just as powerful as high explosives. The Jericho Trumpet remains the most iconic sound of World War II, a sound that has been used in countless movies and documentaries to signify death and destruction. The Stuka proved the effectiveness of close air support, a concept that every modern military in the world now considers essential. Without the Ju-87, we might never have seen the development of the A-10 Warthog or the modern attack helicopter. However, the Stuka also serves as a warning about the dangers of overspecialization. It was a masterpiece in one specific role, dive bombing, but it was helpless in almost every other situation. It required a perfect environment to function, and the moment that environment changed, the Stuka began to fail. It was a machine built for a war of conquest, and it was ill-suited for a war of defense. Its fixed gear and slow speed were compromises that eventually became its death sentence, showing that in the rapid evolution of aerial warfare, yesterday's smart weapon is tomorrow's sitting duck. Today, only a handful of Ju-87 Stukas survive in museums, such as the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago and the RAF Museum in London. Standing next to one, you can feel the rugged, brutal nature of its construction. It doesn't have the grace of a Mustang or the elegance of a Spitfire. It looks like a tool, a heavy, iron crowbar designed to break open the world. Its crooked wings and massive radiator give it a menacing, prehistoric appearance that still commands respect and a lingering sense of unease. It is a haunting artifact from a time when the sky was a place of pure, screaming terror. The story of the Ju-87 is also the story of the men who flew it, pilots who lived with a level of stress that is hard to imagine. From the terrifying, blackout dives to the low-level tank hunts, they were a breed apart. Men like Rudel became legends, but thousands of others disappeared into the clouds, their stories lost in the fires of the Eastern Front. The Stuka was their home, their shield, and often their coffin. It was a machine that demanded everything from its crew, offering them no protection from enemy fighters while asking them to fly into the mouth of hell on every mission. In the final analysis, the Ju-87 Stuka was the ultimate expression of the Luftwaffe's tactical vision. It was a weapon that achieved terrifying success and suffered catastrophic failure, often on the same day. It was the siren of terror, a machine that changed the face of war and left a scar on the memory of the 20th century. Though its sirens have long been silent, the image of the vulture-winged bomber diving from the clouds remains the definitive image of the Blitzkrieg, a reminder of a time when the world trembled at the sound of a scream from the sky.